This is session 3 for Navigating the Path to Emotional Wellness, being sponsored by the Gastonia Parish Nurse Ministry, and I'm Lisa Marissa Dea. I'm the Gastonia Parish Nurse. My next speaker is Russ Keeney. Russ is a licensed counselor in North Carolina, affiliated with CareNet Counseling, which is an affiliate of Wake Forest Baptist Health. Russ has experience with individuals, couples, adolescents, and family therapy. And he's committed to helping individuals discover their true selves in a safe and nurturing atmosphere. His background in trauma and family work have become well known in the community and amongst other professionals. He is committed to creating a safe place to look inward and invites people to integrate their own faith and spirituality, and in turn becomes whole in body, mind, and spirit. He believes that along life's journeys, we all need occasional assistance to help deal with the stressors of life and to reclaim the fullness that life can offer. I've had the privilege of working with Russ at First Presbyterian Church, Gastonia, and just really grateful that he's been willing to help plan this event with me and speak as well. So Russ's talk is on secondary trauma and PTSD, and I'm going to turn it over to Russ Keeney. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate it. We got together, Lisa and I, probably back in January, and we thought it'd be interesting to have a number of different topics for mental health issues, because there's so many people out in this area who are specialized in different areas, and today we are just blessed to have some really, really good speakers. The topic today is actually secondary trauma and vicarious trauma. I put PTSD at first, but the focus is going to be about secondary trauma. And before we get into it, I need to tell you just a little bit about myself and why this is such an important area for me. My dad, if you ever know me for any period of time, you're going to discover my dad is my hero. He passed away in 2007. I always looked up to him. My father was a prison guard. He was actually in a maximum security prison, and then he moved to a minimum for about four years at the end of his career. And I was always amazed at the strength that he had in going to work and coming home. But I was also curious because he never spoke about what he saw day in and day out. And it was always curious to me. And as I got older and as I started to finish my education and get into my career, some things really struck me about my dad. He saw things every single day that most people don't see in a lifetime at the prison. And when he came home, it was really hard for him to adjust to family life. He was a great dad, there's no doubt about it. I mean, he did everything he could for his kids, would have bent over backwards for him. But it really struck me that somebody who could be so committed to their job didn't always know how to transfer into being a dad. Now, I had 4 siblings. There's a lot of things going on at home. He would come home and say hello to everybody, and it was great, but he became more and more distant as his career went on. I want to read something to you because my experience is also in social work. I was a social worker here in Gaston County for about 18 years, and I experienced a lot of secondhand trauma, vicarious trauma. We're going to go over some of the definitions of that. And I think it's very curious that for so long, I've talked to so many different workers who have the same things going on, but there was no real definition of what's going on. It was always, get through it, or either this is the job for you or it's not. And those are all interesting things to say, but they're certainly not things I want to hear if I'm approaching burnout. I want to read you something that a colleague of mine, Kim Leppard, who's going to be speaking later on today, wrote, and I think it is accurate to a T as far as somebody who has experienced burnout and secondhand trauma and what that does to you. Having been a social worker for 30 years and a DSS worker for 10 of them, I know what it is like to walk in dangerous situations armed only with an ID, my instinct, and the belief in humanity. I had police officers tell me that they would not do my job without carrying a weapon. We were given safety training and taught how and where to sit in a home and park the car so we could escape quickly as possible. It was the most dangerous job I ever did, and I would not give it up for anything. The stories that we and our colleagues could tell you would go on and on. We talk about heroes and first responders, and let's not forget about these men and women. They put their lives on the line, protect children and families. They are charged with being the voice and protection of our most vulnerable population. Caught in the weird space between hero and villain, the pay sucks, the hours suck even more. They experience emotions most of us never knew existed. They know a side of society that we would prefer not to know exists. They have conversations with evil people, and they have conversations with people that bring them to tears, and sometimes and often it's the same person. Social workers never feel truly connected with others. They don't come home and honestly answer the question, "How was your day?" Most days, they just want to take a shower and wash the day off. They are amazing listeners, and hearing about your day is an escape from theirs. I used to avoid telling new people what I did for a living, anything to avoid the look, and we all know what that look is. Bringing up my occupation was a sure party stopper. The energy instantly got heavy, and my go-to was humor to lighten the mood, but usually it didn't go over very well. I was usually looked at as a crazy person. And I read that because I think that's very telling what a lot of people who are in the caring profession, in the helping profession, frontline workers go through. You experience this very unique situation. The pressure is enormous. And then you're supposed to get in your car and go home and experience normal life. So when I was thinking about secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, I thought, a lot of people out there carry this with them. It's not just social workers. It's not just ER nurses, which I have total respect for. It's the teachers. It's law enforcement. It's attorneys who actually are dealing with people who are just horrible people to deal with, but they have to because that's their job. And when you're around somebody long enough, you start to wear and start to collect some of their trauma with you. It's just natural. That's what we do. We got into this because we like helping people. But what they don't tell you in school, what they didn't tell me in seminary, was that you have to take care of yourself because it's a very slippery slope, and eventually you're going to go down. So before we get into the who's and what's, I want to give some definitions. Next slide. So trauma definitions, can you go back one? Okay. All right, I'm going to read it. There you go. All right. So defining exposure to trauma in the workplace. Trauma in the workplace can be experienced in two ways, as a primary trauma or a secondary trauma. And today we're going to talk mostly about secondary trauma because this is really focused to people who are going out there and putting their lives on the line to be able to help people. Primary trauma is defined as the result of a traumatic event that happened directly to a person. This may be a trauma that occurred in their personal life or exposure to a traumatic event in the line of duty. Secondary trauma is the result of being witness to a traumatic event or series of events. The exposure may occur in the form of hearing stories, seeing images or videos, reading details of a case file, listening to graphic court testimony and or graphic debriefing by a colleague. One of the phrases that I've always been really curious about, and you might hear this if you're around people who do this, is called sliming. This idea that when you talk to somebody, and I've experienced it, unfortunately, I've slimed many people in my career. I'm not real proud of that. But when you talk to somebody, you're talking, you're trying to vent, you're trying to get all this stuff out. But what you don't realize you're doing is you're sliming them. In other words, they carry that with them, especially people who are not used to this type of pressure, this type of day in and day out trauma. I can remember very clearly years ago, it was a weekend and it was probably close to the beginning of my career as a social worker. And some friends were having a barbecue and I thought, oh, that's great, I just need to relax, go out, have a beer, just enjoy myself. And we were talking just matter-of-factly, and somebody asked me, and I didn't know. I mean, I was going to answer the question, so how's work? And I just answered very plainly, well, it's not too bad. We took a kid into custody. It was pretty tough. It was a horrible situation without mentioning any names. And I didn't think anything of it. Well, here's the thing. About a year and a half later, this friend of mine asked me what happened to that family. To me, I said it and I didn't think anything more of it. That's what sliming is. You have to be aware that as a worker, you have a lot of trauma that kind of gets built up on you. And when you tell stories, believe it or not, you can traumatize somebody. That's what secondary trauma is. So when we hear stories from other people, from clients, we start to collect it. And the reality of it is, unless you're collecting it, you're probably not very good at your job. It is a very, very fine balance. And one thing I need to say that oftentimes secondary trauma leads to primary trauma. Primary trauma is that event that happens and you witness it and you have to experience it and you bring it home because it directly affected you. A lot of times when we develop this sense of who we do and what we do in our jobs, the secondary trauma is a part of us. But as we start doing our jobs, we become more and more susceptible to primary trauma. And there's a lot of give and take between them. Next slide. Some definitions, just matter of factly. Burnout. Burnout's the physical and emotional exhaustion helpers may experience due to a low job satisfaction, feeling of powerlessness, and being overwhelmed in the workplace. This definition does not include exposure to trauma, but this term has been used when talking about certainly the child welfare workforce and many other agencies. So burnout is that thing where I have nothing left. You think you have nothing left. Next slide. Compassion fatigue. This is the profound emotional and physical exhaustion that helping professionals and caregivers can develop over the course of a career as helpers. This is a gradual erosion of the things that keep them connected to others in their caregiver role. So the compassion fatigue is, in some ways, it's almost unavoidable if you're doing your job right. The trick to doing your job right means knowing how to eventually take care of yourself in recognizing that I might need help. So compassion fatigue happens. If you're beyond compassion fatigue, burnout is probably very much a part of what you're doing. And it's something to consider, actually considering, we're going to talk about this later, what your career should be. Next slide. Vicarious trauma is the profound shift that helpers experience in their worldview working with clients who experience trauma. Fundamental beliefs about the world are altered and possibly damaged due to repeated exposures to traumatic material. So, and I experienced this a lot firsthand, watching other people, that after you do this after a period of time, and if your primary folks that you're socializing and interacting with are people who have experienced trauma, it becomes very easy to look at the world in a very negative way, to look at families in a negative way, to look at parents in a negative way, to look at criminals in a negative way, to all of this. It's because you're not getting enough healthy socialization going on. All right, next slide. So secondary trauma, ST, we're going to refer to it as ST, burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma can all be placed under the heading of secondary stress reaction. In a lot of ways, a lot of these terms are they kind of represent each other. There's not really enough work yet to say that this is what secondary trauma is, this is what burnout. These are terms that a lot of therapists agree with and some of them disagree with. In doing the work of restoring the lives of a person who have been traumatized, workers often absorb the same trauma. Secondary traumatic stress mimic those of direct trauma stress reactions or post-traumatic stress. It can be defined as this, and this is from Olmsted County Child Family Services in North Carolina. It can be defined as this: the emotional cost of caring, a response to the cumulative experience of empathic engagement with people who are suffering and or struggling. It is the personal experience resulting from helping or wanting to help the person in need. All right, so we're getting an interesting framework of what secondary trauma is. All right, so and I'm going to go through these, and again, these stats, some of them are about 10 years old. I'm sure there are more recent stats on this, but I think this is very telling nonetheless, and certainly this is not an exhaustive list of all helpers. I found that teachers are not included in this. Teachers go through this all the time. There's a variety, but bear with me. Depending on the studies, between 40% and 85% of helping professionals were found to have compassion fatigue and high rates of traumatic symptoms. Next. Social workers in the MSW level, 70% exhibited at least one symptom of secondary traumatic stress. Social workers in general, 42% say they suffered from secondary traumatic stress. Social workers working with DV and sexual assault, 65% had at least one symptom of secondary traumatic stress. Next. Therapists working with sexual assault victims, 70% experienced vicarious trauma. Hospice nurses, 79% had moderate to high rates of compassion fatigue. 83% didn't have a debriefing support after the patient's death. Immigration judges, especially now, higher burnout levels than hospital physicians and prison wardens. Now you think about that. A judge who is deciding the fate over somebody's immigration and the amount of power. And judges, I've met some amazing judges here in Gaston County, but I can't imagine that kind of stress that you might bring home with you. Next. Law enforcement, 33% showed high level of emotional exhaustion and reduced personal accomplishment. 56.1% scored high on the depersonalization scale. And that basically is the same thing we talk about, having a very negative worldview, and it happens. I know a lot of people who are in law enforcement, my dad included. You start to develop this separation from the people you're working with. It's just natural. I have the highest respect for police and law enforcement. That is something I've always respected, and I will continue to respect as a therapist. Only 15% of law enforcement professionals were willing to seek personal counseling as a result of vicarious trauma versus 59% of mental health professionals. Forensic investigators, internet crimes against children, 36% of investigators were experiencing moderate to high levels of secondary trauma. Child welfare workers, that's kind of a general term, 50% had traumatic stress symptoms in severe ranges. 34% met the PTSD diagnosis criteria due to secondary trauma stress. Child Protective Service workers, something very dear to my heart. 37% reported clinical levels of emotional distress associated with secondary traumatic stress. Child protection workers, 50% suffered from high to very high levels of compassion fatigue. Female forensic interviewers, 34% reported experienced symptoms of secondary traumatic stress. And again, these are stats that I've read. They have changed, I'm sure. That last stat, the last two were from 06. We're in 2020 now. But nonetheless, these are things that we have to consider if you're going into the field. All right. So what are some common symptoms of secondary stress? And these might seem familiar if you're in the field, if you go, oh, yeah, I get what you're talking about. Great, that's the beginning. Recollection, dreams, reminders of the events cause anxiety and physical reactions. I can remember as a social worker, there are certain neighborhoods I would go into that I knew I was going to spend most of my time in that neighborhood. And now, if I even drive by that neighborhood, I want to avoid it. Not because I think it's a terrible neighborhood, but it still brings up to me. And I've been removed from working as a social worker for about 2.5 years now. But there's a sense where I'm not ready for that. I'm not ready to even look at that neighborhood because I know what goes on in that neighborhood. Avoidance of thoughts or feelings. And this happens a lot. We separate ourselves. We separate ourselves from being vulnerable to other people who may not understand what you're going through. Avoidance of activities or situations. Things that used to bring you joy, like going out golfing, going out finding a hobby, now happen maybe once a month or once a year, whereas before it was something that really, really helped you. Gaps in memory, that can happen. That can happen because your mind is trying to protect you, all right? And there are times where I don't remember what happened. When you have a work day that normally goes 9 to 10 hours a day regularly, and you're never sure what is going to meet you when you come in the door that morning. You could be there till 10, 11 at night. There comes this time just out of self-protection and self-preservation that I have to develop a routine because I'm not going to make it. I know I have to do this job. This is what I like to do. This is who I am, says somebody in the caring field. But I don't know how to get out of that routine when I'm not here. All right. So feeling estranged from others. That memo I wrote from Miss Leppert was exactly on. You don't know how to talk to people. I think about my dad a lot during those times where he would come home, and we were all excited, to see him come home because we all really loved him and we cared about him. He'd come home in his prison garb, and he'd come home, he'd say hello to everybody, and then we wouldn't see him. He'd go to his room to try to decompress. And there was a sense as he got farther and farther into his career, there was a sense where I'm just not sure what to do with this. Feeling trapped in work. How many times? Here's the reality. There are a lot of jobs out there. There are a lot of jobs that you can do that will be able to help you hone your skill, hone your craft, that doesn't involve 10-hour days, that doesn't involve all of your weekends. Get your experience and then look, because your mental health, who you are as a person, is much more important than what you do. And I'm going to go back to this because that is something I do with a lot of people who come into my counseling office. Feeling a sense of hopelessness, difficulty concentrating, having all this work to do and not knowing exactly how to get through it. Next slide. An increased use of alcohol and drugs is a coping mechanism. Eddie talked about this quite a bit, and there's a lot of substance abuse that goes on with people who are in the field. Exaggerated sense of responsibility. In other words, if I do this, I have to be on all the time, and I'm the go-to person. And I can't be looked at as somebody who's vulnerable. I've got to be the go-to person because this is who I am. This is what I did or do. And the reality is, you are much more than that. God has made you an amazing person. He has created a wholeness in you that when you forget so much about who you are and who God created you to be, it's like eliminating this wonderful part, this beautiful part of your life. Impaired ability to make decisions, forgetfulness, that happens all the time, problems in personal relationships, and I like this, and it was when I was doing the research for this, I like this. The silencing response. So after you've done it for a period of time, the silencing response is basically, I'm here to interview or work with this family, but I don't want to know too much. Because if I know too much, it means I'm going to get into it. And if I get into it, I'm committed to it. And I know that even though on paper it only looks like I've been here for an hour, but when I get into it, it's going to be at least 5, 6, 7 hours a week that I'm committed to just this one family or just this one child. And as you start to get burnt out and you have secondary trauma, you remove yourself. You do just enough to be able to check, but then to go home. All right? Which basically means you're not giving your best product. And the people who we serve are people who are in need. They are the disenfranchised. They are the poor. They are the people who just need someone to hold their hand. And if we can't go that extra mile without totally being affected by it, we need to do some reconsiderations. All right, next slide. So there is a facet, I'm going to touch on this just a little bit, and hopefully maybe in another talk we can talk a little more about this. And we've heard about these things called mirror neurons. They're amazing. They're absolutely amazing. It was a discovery made in Italy that where they were working with monkeys, and they found that they hooked these monkeys up in their electrodes, and they had a lunch break. And as the people who were working, in the lab were eating lunch, they noticed the monkeys were responding to the people who were eating lunch as though they were enjoying it themselves. So they discovered, in looking more into it, that we have these mirror neurons within us. It's this way of kind of connecting with people. And if you have a friend who you've been friends with for a long time, you start repeating, and you start finishing sentences, you start moving and walking in the same way. It's just what we do. So mirror neurons fire when a person acts or observes the same action in another. Neurons mirror the behavior of the other as though the observer were itself acting. When we see an action in another, we are able to anticipate what will happen before it happens. In a quote from Dr. Van der Valk, when people are in sync with each other, they tend to stand or sit in similar ways, and their voices take on the same rhythms. But mirror neurons also make us vulnerable to others' negativity, so that we respond to their anger and depression, and with the same emotions are taken down with them. So here's an interesting thing, and this is Family Counseling 101. The term enmeshment. Enmeshment is when you're with somebody, and somebody may not be doing well, and you're enmeshed with that person so much that when they go down, you kind of follow them. You think as though that when they're having trouble, that I need to follow them, and that enmeshment brings them down. And unfortunately, when you have two people who are enmeshed, it's not a healthy relationship because one is not strong enough to bring up the other. So what's the impact on workplace? Low rates of staff satisfaction and retention, right? Something to consider. A decrease in agency efficiency, morale, and quality of work. Increase in staff turnover. Disruption of relationship continuity with clients. Increase in caseloads and stress levels for those who stay behind, and the economic loss to the agency given the costs associated with hiring and training. All right. Killian and Machu suggest some key elements for organizations to focus on to help minimize the impact of secondary trauma. Those include timely, regular, quality debriefing, timely, regular, and quality supervision. That's huge. Social support at work, rotation of traumatic caseloads, training on trauma-informed practices, control over one's schedule, and success in one's work. In other words, they need to be reminded that you're successful and you can do this. And just because you're having trouble today, it doesn't mean that this is who you are. It just means you're having a tough day. Next slide. So important things to consider in the helping field, and I think these are things that you need to ask yourself if you're going to go into the helping field or if you're in the helping field now. One, what made you choose this line of work? And it's okay when you first get into the helping field to have an idea and for it to kind of flow as you learn more about the field. But it's important also to understand what is the original reason why I got into this, because one of the things that traumatic stress does is it takes you away and takes you far away from the original intent of what is it I want to do. If I'm no longer effective as a helper, what am I doing here? I shouldn't be here. I need to take time off. Next. What keeps you going and sustains you as a person and a professional given the challenges of your work, all right? So you have to take account. You have to be very intentional of what are some strong points in my job, what are some points that I need to be aware of. But you can't just let them happen. You've got to look at everything that you can. Third, what concrete strategies have a significant difference in you and have allowed you to remain healthy and well in this career? That could be strategies at work and also strategies at home. Because if your home life is not strong, believe me, it is going to affect your work. You know, none of us are perfect. We all have things. We all carry into this. I heard a therapist numerous times tell me, he says, I get tired when people ask me what I do, and they tell me that, well, you probably never get depressed or you probably never get anxious. There is this sense where somehow, as a therapist, that I am somehow removed from anxiety and removed from depression. It doesn't work that way. I am human. I carry it. I've learned how to carry it, but I'm also very, very aware that my home life has got to be very different than my work life. All right, next slide. If you were to do it all over again, ask yourself, is there anything else you would do differently? All right, that's an important question. It really is. All right. And one last thing, important things to consider in the helping field, reflecting on success. How have you made a difference to others? That is huge. It's hard for somebody who's experiencing secondary trauma to actually admit they're experiencing secondary trauma, because we want to be above that. All right, but you have to ask yourself, am I still making a difference? Am I still helping people? All right. So we've got 4 steps to wellness. First, take stock of your stressors. Okay, so take stock. When you're in a situation and you're forced to work a 9 or 10-hour day, and on top of that, document, and on top of that, have a smile on your face when you see clients, all these different things, you have to take time to step back and think, what's really stressing me out here? Because the reality of it is, and I've heard this so many different times, that the amount of stress that you're experiencing isn't nearly the amount that is the reality. We get caught up into stress, and we get this inner dialogue going that keeps us from experiencing the trueness of who we are and who God created us to be. A professor of mine, I say this to a lot of my clients because it's a really interesting image. And I can't remember, it was quite a bit of time ago, I'm kind of old. So he said, I want you to imagine yourself swimming in a large body of water, and there's no land in sight. And as you're swimming, at first you're enjoying the water. You're enjoying it because it's cool and you like to swim. And 5 minutes goes by, and suddenly you start to realize, okay, this isn't as enjoyable, I'm still enjoying it. 10 minutes goes by, and you're really starting to get tired. 15 minutes goes by, you're swimming, and you're no longer swimming, you're just paddling. And as you're about to sink, and you think to yourself, this is it, I'm done, a voice from the heavens says, just stand up, it was never over your head. I think about that a lot. Stress causes you to think about your life in such a terrible way that you cannot see hope. You refuse to see hope. You refuse that it can be different, because if you do, somehow you have given up. All right? That's what secondary trauma does. All right, next slide. Look for ways to enhance your self-care and work-life balance. There's so many different things now. I recently experienced, it was an amazing experience. I didn't think it'd be as amazing as it was. I did a cold water immersion therapy, where you sit in the tub, you do a yoga. Bill Wilder up in Mooresville, he has a spa up there, and you sit in the tub, and you basically sit in this ice water, and you're scared to death of going in. And as you're sitting in the tub, your fight or flight response starts to pick up. And the first thing I want to do is get out of the tub, because I thought, I'm going to die, because it hurts. It actually hurts your skin. But your body starts to acclimate. Right? And I found that I could really find an inner strength and an inner confidence as I was sitting in that ice water, because it no longer hurt my skin. It was still a little bit painful, but I realized my strength, my energy comes from within. It doesn't come from my surroundings. And if I could learn how to really look at that, and that's what I really try to do with people in counseling, is how do I find your inner strength? It's something that will carry through a lot. Third, develop resiliency skills. Resiliency is that ability to bounce back. You had a bad day, all right, sleep it off. Next day is beautiful. Find it. Some people use meditation. Some people use prayer. I've been practicing Lectio Divino. It's an older form of prayer that has just been amazing. It has transformed my life. It involves prayer, reading scripture, meditating, and contemplating. And it is something if you have any interest in that, just look it up. It's just amazing. But finding ways to bounce back after a hard day, those are really important. And fourth, make a commitment to implement changes. Here's the thing. You're not going to do any change unless you see that there's a reason for it. All right. People need to believe, people who are in the helping profession need to believe that what you do is not your sum total. There's more to you. There's a beautiful side to you that you need to rediscover, to re-experience. And one of the questions I ask, especially people who are from this field, who come into my office, one of the first questions I ask is, who are you? And typically, somebody who's in the helping field and is experiencing burnout or secondary trauma is going to say, I'm a social worker, I'm a police officer, I'm a hospice nurse. No, that's not who you are. Who are you? Because when you leave that job, you've got to find your other self, the other part of you that you put to the side when you're helping people. Because if you don't, it's not going to last. You will get burned out. You will feel secondary trauma.
We do have some questions here. How do you find inner strength in the midst of secondary stress that appears hopeless?
That's a great question, and that's a very common question, especially for people who are experiencing secondary stress. The first thing is ask people that you trust. I've always been told that you need to have people who are going to be honest with you, who aren't just going to pat you in the back. Just ask them, do you see anything different in me? How do you view me? Those are very important questions. And then realize that, number one, you're not alone. That's this whole idea of isolation, especially now, you're not alone. People go through this, and there are ways of getting through it. We oftentimes have this idea that when we're feeling stressed, we need to do more. We need to do different things. We need to learn different things to get out of it. And it doesn't work that way. I often tell people it's actually almost counterintuitive. You need to do less. You need to sit back. You need to find ways to be quiet. People who don't meditate, I challenge them. So just do it for 3 minutes. Just sit in your backyard. Don't say a word. No phones, nobody. Just sit and listen. And as you start to do it, you start to realize, I can do this. And your brain becomes very much accustomed that I can do this. There is a better place for me. So,
thank you. Russ, how can we keep ourselves from experiencing secondhand stress when a stressful situation is taking place for a loved one?
That's hard because we care about these people. And there are different situations when, certainly with drugs, I hate addictions. I hate it because of what it does to people. It changes people. Their personality has changed. Their motivation to live has changed. And loved ones get dragged down with it. It happens. But we have to look at the bigger picture. The idea of tough love needs to happen sometimes. And it's not being mean. It's simply saying to yourself, I see a better way for you. And I want to help you do that, but I'm not going to be drawn into it. And again, talking about this whole idea of enmeshment. When we get close to people, are you bringing me down? Because I'm not any good to anybody if I'm coming down with you.
Very good. Thank you. How do you maintain that delicate balance of empathy of the person with detachment from that person to minimize secondary trauma as you practice pastoral care?
That's a great question, because there is a sense in some ways, unless you have some type of transference with people, you're not effective. So there's a fine line, and it's what therapists have to learn, and if they're going to stay into it. How do I feel what you're feeling, but still have one foot in the reality? And Russell Seiler, he taught a course on spirituality and counseling. He says it's almost as though you have to have 1 foot in the world and 1 foot in the mystic. And I really like that, because there is the sense where we are inviting people to share, and we're inviting it, and we have to feel at a certain level, what are you going through? But we also have to be strong enough to realize there's a different way, and it is tough. People who are in this field, you've got to be careful. I oftentimes between sessions, if I have time, I'll just walk around the parking lot, and just kind of breathe, don't think about anything, leave my phone in my office, and it helps, so.
Could you name the specific type of meditation that you use again?
I don't know if I have. I use meditation. It is, I think if you're talking about Lectio Divino, that is it's a faith-based practice. I was actually taught this by some of the monks over at Belmont Abbey. I talk with them on occasion, and it really is an amazing process to be able to sit. For me as a Christian, I'll read Scripture, and certainly just the Psalms, and I've always taught that you just read a small portion of the Psalm and just kind of concentrate on it, pray about it, meditate on it, which is huge, and then contemplate it. And there's a lot of strength to it. And I will say that you have to work at it. It's not something that comes naturally. Most of us, when we sit and meditate, we're like, okay, and we look at our timer, like, okay, I got to get going. That's not what meditation's all about. That's not what prayer's all about. So Lectio Divino, I can't know if I can spell it to you. If you typed it in, there's a lot of work on it right now. So there's a lot of books written about it.
we'll put some links in the survey email that goes out later today. So a lot of these questions, looking for resources, we will have a list that go out to all of you for some of this.
All right.
But again, I thank you.
Thank
you
you.
so much for being
Thank
here
you.
today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I love having Russ right down the hall from me at First Presbyterian, so it's a great place to visit and have his support. So if you are in need of talking with someone, we have some great counselors today, but Russ being one of those, we'll put everyone's contact information in that email as well if you would like to contact them.
All right.
Appreciate that.